Wednesday to all of the degeneritas out there. If you're a degenerate or a degenerati, hope your week is going well. Welcome back to the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 298, featuring Alexander Volkanovski and Ilia Topuria. A highly, highly anticipated main event for quite some time. I've noticed from the time that I first started doing this that Topuria was one of the most hyped prospects coming out, or at least on the rise, going back about 2 years ago now. And it is interesting for me to think back on the first big success that I had at UFC London in March 2022 when Topuria fought Jai Herbert. Only the third fight he's had, or the third furthest fight back that he's had in that 2-year stretch, and he did barely make it onto the main card of that. I was looking back to see if he had actually been on the prelims. He was, in fact, included as the first fight of the main card, but just to show you how meteoric Topuria's rise has been, I just thought I'd harken back to that real quick. It is a highly anticipated bout, though, no doubt, in spite of the fact that we haven't necessarily seen Topuria compete a lot since then. But the results have been nothing short of impressive, submitting Bryce Mitchell, scoring a 50-43 over Josh Emmett last year in what was my first clean sweep on the record for MMA Rax at what I believe was UFC Jacksonville. I thought that was an interesting place for Topuria to have his first main event fight. And obviously we now fast forward to not quite a year later, but February of the following year, and Topuria is headlining and taking on Volkanovski for the title off of that success. And I'd say that he definitely deserves the shot in spite of the fact that, again, he's really only got Mitchell and Emmett as his claims, and only finished one of those two. And some people do forget, particularly the ones that have been on the Topuria train since he got into the UFC, that he did in fact get knocked down by Jai Herbert. That night I had the plus 1.5 rounds, and it was the only pick I missed at UFC London that cost me an 11-leg parlay. So that fight lives on in my memory. I was 90 seconds away from turning $45 into $22,000. Instead, I just had to settle for a meager 5-leg parlay with the help of Mr. Paul Craig and some others. I got plus odds on the under 2.5 rounds in Volkov versus Aspinall that night, which in hindsight is hilarious because Aspinall's now the interim heavyweight champion. On the flip side of things for Volkanovski, you've seen plenty of optimism this week too, although I think about the hype that he had going into the Makhachev fight, his most recent appearance, in spite of the short notice, and I remember grading that dead even and really, really wanting to pick Makhachev because even in the 200 range, I had been wondering if there was really going to be an opportunity to get him at the same price again as there had been. I believe against Oliveira, he was somewhere around like minus 185. And I remember a consistent headline when he fought Charles was, you got to think about if this guy wins this fight, if you're going to be able to get him at these odds again in the future. And it's hard to imagine getting Makhachev inside 200 again since that happened. Obviously didn't get it against Volkanovski. And he more than lived up to that price with a first-round head kick. And that's going to be a theme that I am going to touch on again in terms of getting this fighter at these odds, given the stage of their career that they're at, is something that I think you really need to take into account here when betting the main event. But I've got 7 other fights to talk about first. And I also want to recap last week, UFC Vegas 86, because It was disappointing in a variety of ways. Obviously, having a bit of a swing on Pyfer at the end was kind of devastating, and it was interesting. I didn't see a lot of optimism around Jack Hermansson going into the fight, and then afterwards, you saw a lot of people that were doing the kind of told you so routine relative to, oh, I actually had a ticket on Hermansson, which I see that a lot in terms of people that are just kind of waiting for the result to come in and then bragging about it afterwards, as opposed to really riding and dying with their pick and their analysis ahead of time. You got to represent your results the right way in this if you want to expand your brand and your presence. So I can appreciate that, but I'm someone that has, in spite of the fact that I'm not on BetMMA.tips, I'm someone that has striven for transparency week in and week out, and I will continue to do that. So Pyfer isn't really the pick that I missed last week that I want to touch on as much as a couple of the other ones, but just to kind of quickly go back and recap Vegas 86, I think I will start with the Pyfer event. He was one of my strongest grades last week, and the one thing that I had been concerned about, and I kind of voiced this in the weigh-in chat while on Friday, was, if this fight does get drawn out past the opening rounds, not even necessarily the third round, but just the second round, what is it going to look like for Pyfer if he hasn't been checking the leg kicks? Because he really did not do a good job of that against Al Hassan. That was probably the one criticism that folks had for him coming out of that fight. But I thought that between the layoff for Hermansson, which seemed to be evident even if he did end up shaking it off, he still ended up dropping the first 2 rounds of the fight. And if, he had, one strike goes another way or lands differently and he's not able to just lean on the jab as much through the closing 15 minutes, if Pyfer's able to take the 4th round, which I thought watching, as obviously with my bias, I was kind of hoping that the judges were going to get a robbery phoned in from Uncle Dana and, just kind of give Pyfer an inexplicable split based on how the 4th round was maybe a little more ambiguous than the 3rd or the 5th. But that didn't end up happening. And a lot of people were, saying, oh, yeah, we knew Pyfer was going to get pushed to that and that it wasn't going to go well. But based on the fact that Hermansson had been, suffered several finishes at that point, and the only knockout loss of Pyfer's career had really been that shoulder injury he suffered against Dolston Stofoots on Contender Series, it was reasonable for me to, I think, for the price that Pyfer was at, to conclude that he's going to be able to deal with attrition better than Hermansson did. And he just really wasn't able to capitalize on whatever damage that he was doing in the first 2 rounds to let him, if not take over the fight down the stretch, then at least capitalize on something that would have given him an opening to take one of the rounds away in the 3rd, 4th, or 5th and get a 48-47. So that swing was disappointing. Hindsight's 20/20. If I had, obviously, if I had to do it over again, yeah, I'd probably want to lean more on the more, some of the other better priced spots that I still was kind of able to telegraph where the fight was going to go, like Rodolfo Vieira or Michael Johnson. But, even Michael Johnson had, a bit of a scare at the end of the 3rd round in his fight. And Vieira, that fight, the narrative was, and this is the way it goes whenever you're leaning on a guy that's going for a submission win, it gets harder to do it the further out of the first round you get. Fighters get more tired and they get slipperier because of the sweat. It's harder to lock in chokes and whatnot. But Vieira he was able to capitalize on Petrosian's takedown defense and tendency to give up his back the way that I thought he would have. And it would have been better last week to lean on those commodities and then pair those with and over like the Wells Griffin fight, which was basically the same price at close that Pyfer was. So hindsight's 2020, and I had been doing pretty well with main event picks despite not leaning on them in recent weeks. So I just kind of look at it as bad luck, and I don't necessarily want to call it a bad beat because it kind of sounds like excuse making, and I did assume what the risk was with Pyfer, but I'm not as upset about that one relative to my own decision making as I am with the Devin Clark fight. Now, before I get into that, I do want to acknowledge the Pauga fight because Pauga was actually the strongest grade that I had last week. And some people I saw were kind of, maybe, in the moment trying to say, Pauga was getting his clinch game going and whatever, and it would have been interesting to see how that fight went the longer it went. But the truth is, you knew based on that knockout that he suffered against Usman that there was going to be some chin liability there relative to a guy like Guskov, who we've seen knock people out pretty badly on regional circuit. So the problem is when you're long-term betting on what numbers are telling you in this, the way that I am, you get a small sample size like Guskov that's only based on 3 minutes of a fight he took on short notice and lost. It's going to make a guy like Pauga, who has, the better numbers across the board, but is in a lot of ways just a guy that kind of leans on decisions, which I've talked about before is not really conducive to success at the heavier weight classes, more so heavyweight than light heavyweight. But you generally, across the board, want to see fighters that are looking for finishes as opposed to leaning on decisions and point fighting. And that's less true, I think, in boxing than it is in MMA. But in MMA, it just because so much of it is less based about point fighting and volume than it is kind of aesthetics and damage. The guys that are going for the finishes are typically the ones that you're going to want to lean on heavier. So for that reason, I kept Pauga out of, even though I had the strongest grade on him last week, I recognized the small sample. But going forward, knowing those short notice fights that have very small samples on them, I think I need to do a better job of trying to stay away from those relative to whatever feedback I'm getting, especially if I have concerns about a fighter like Pauga that I've evaluated before and has previous UFC appearances. Now, I say that knowing that I'm about to break down Oban Elliott, Val Woodburn in a minute, and I've already picked Elliott to win. But I'll explain how, just because we haven't seen Elliott, in the UFC yet, just really the Contender Series appearance, how it's a little bit different there relative to what you can expect with Woodburn. But I just need to do a better job going forward of when I get these super strong grades like what I had last week and then weighing them against the guy that's going to have the obviously better finishing upside, just trying to stay away from those. And to that point, now I want to talk about a fight that I'm going to very, very much have live on in terms of my red flags and my memory for evaluating going forward. And that is Devin Clark and Marcin Prachnio. I haven't had a lot of success with figuring out either of these two. I did fade Prachnio against Vitor Petrino, UFC Brazil, which was, I think, the last event that I really had like an outright winning night that didn't get compromised by a draw or a no contest. I've actually had 3 events that have been compromised by no contests or draws going back to, I think whatever the pay-per-view was when Pereira fought Blachowicz. It was on my birthday, actually, back in November. And Nazim Sadikov drew with Vyacheslav Borshev, and that cost me like an outright. It amended the return that I got on that event, and then last week would have had another winning event if the Alishkab Kizriev fight didn't get stopped immediately because of the eye poke. And then I put out a very strong read on the Daniel Marcos Arichi Long fight last week, in which you saw several people professing confidence in Arichi Long for reasons that escape me. And then, I don't want to ever accuse a fighter of outright quitting, but there were a lot of other people that were looking at what happened and considering that Arichi Long took the easy way out. So it was tough to see that, but even though the night didn't start out great and that put me in a bad mood, just seeing like another no contest, like, you got to be fucking kidding me. I really got to deal with another pick that I put out getting compromised like this. This is fucking ridiculous. I'm still mostly mad about what happened with Devin Clark. And if there's an important betting lesson in this fight, I think, for a lot of people to recognize relative to the finishing upside that I just kind of spoke about, with wanting to mostly align yourself with that when you're making these picks and these bets. It was, I think, pretty obvious that the guy with the finishing upside in that fight was Pragnio, and there wasn't even, submission upside relative to what we thought the wrestling upside was going to be with Devin Clark. It was just that the reason the line was at the 2-1 the way that it was because Pragnio's takedown offense was obviously, if not necessarily his takedown offense, just the visuals of him when he does get taken down in fights like with Felipe Lins and Vitor Petrino, it was easy for him to get washed away in that. And even if maybe he has improved since the Lins fight, in which I hadn't gone public with MMA Rax yet, but I did pick Pragnio to beat Lins that night, and Lins had never shot a takedown in the UFC to that point, and then still ended up winning, and Pragnio was one of my main legs, just because I thought he was going to be able to do more of what he did against Devin Clark against a guy like Lins. So it didn't break my way that night, but I remember being very locked in. I had a good grade on Clark last week to where I felt comfortable playing him in the 200 range. But even when the only upside that you can recognize with a fighter is something that you can't necessarily lean on them doing, you really should not be aligning with that any more than if they're at, say, a pick'em like the Pauga-Guskov fight was. That was more of a case where, because the odds were close enough and Pauga had more UFC experience and whatnot, you could talk yourself into making that pick more realistically than someone probably should have in the case of Devin Clark and Pragnio, because thinking about it conceptually, if you don't get the wrestling from Clark, there's nothing else there for you to feel good about. Clark had no submission upside for all of the wrestling and presumed grappling, or just groundwork, if you want to lump the two together, that the guy was supposed to be the superior fighter at, and had really made the main brand of his success in the UFC. And the striking upside we knew was going to belong to Pragnio. There was just an assumption that Clark, because he knew what his path was not going to entertain the striking, and was going to very easily be able to capitalize on deficiencies that his opponent had exhibited in the past. However, that didn't end up happening. And you could see a 30-27 unfolding. And even when Pragnio was fading away at the end of the third round, and it looked like there was an opportunity maybe for Clark to kind of steal the fight and get a late finish, he did not press on the gas and force the issue in a way that actually would have brought about that result. It was one of the more frustrating picks and performances that I've seen and that I've been attached to. And it's one of the few times that I have been actively disappointed in myself in making that. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that going forward, despite what a grade may tell you, if you're looking at a fight and you recognize that the finishing upside just simply isn't there for the favorite, and that the bulk of their success is going to come from an activity that you can't necessarily rely on them deploying the way that you consistently can for strikers, or at least fighters that have demonstrated a higher level of skill in striking than what the favorite you're looking at has, you really, really just have to stay away from those in spite of whatever the grade may be telling you. Clark tonight, according to the UFC roster tracker, has been released from the UFC. And I think it's appropriate. And obviously this isn't the first time that I've had a main parlay leg get cut loose immediately after, betting on them. Johan Lioness comes to mind only a handful of weeks ago, back in January. But I want to harken back to that Devin Clark fight, just because that's going to be very much something that sits in my memory when I'm looking at other fights going forward, in terms of, can you really feel good about what the end result here could be if they don't deploy what their main game plan is? Because if you're results oriented better, less focused on value than you are picking the results with the highest degree of certainty every week, you really need to cut fights down into 3 possible outcomes: knockouts, submissions, and decisions. Because those are the only 3 ways a fight can end that are going to yield a profitable or losing result, short of a draw or a no contest. And it was obvious the knockout upside belonged to Prachnio, and the submission upside did not belong to either of them, which left only decision upside potentially for Clark. And if you take away the wrestling, there's no way that Clark is going to get a decision. We didn't see the wrestling. Clark lost 30-27. So I'm going to very much make that fight. It's going to live on in my memory, for, I don't want to say the rest of my life because that makes it sound dramatic, but for the rest of my betting career, that's going to be a cornerstone fight that I look to in terms of a mistake that I made, and factoring that into future matchups I evaluate, where I'm looking at the upside for those 3 tiers of possible outcomes I just mentioned. I got to remember, is this feeling like a Devin Clark moment where the striking upside isn't there, even if this guy's an obvious favorite, but if you take away the path to victory that he needs, that he may not necessarily deploy, how are you going to feel as the fight goes along? So that's enough of UFC Vegas 86. I've been talking about a bounce back and need to focus on UFC 298 now to make that happen. So thank you for humoring me through the first 20 plus minutes of this show as I've lamented my losses and licked my wounds. But, for the folks that are regularly following my analysis and tuning into these pay-per-view shows, I hope that you appreciate me being accountable for my mistakes in a way that I think a lot of other people in this space really are not. So I learn lessons from my own, not just my losses, but the mistakes that I make, and I look to, that's how we get better. We make mistakes and we improve. And I think that that's something that Joe Pyfer is going to look forward to doing after his humbling to Jack Hermanson. So if the fighters can do it, I don't see why we can't as human beings and bettors either. So with that note, let's move on to UFC 298. And I will start with the first men's matchup of the evening, which features Oban Elliott and Val Woodburn. Elliott enters 9-2 following a majority decision win on Dana White's Contender Series back in August. Val Woodburn enters 7-1 coming off his first professional loss, a short notice first round, first minute knockout at the hands of the illustrious immaculate. Oh my goodness. Bo Nickel. It's funny because, like I just said in that whole recap of 86, that, I need to be cautious of, going against fighters that have a small sample size. And then and I'm thinking about that as this is the first matchup I'm grading this week, and Val Woodburn has 38 seconds of UFC data on him, which is going to obviously skew the results pretty badly. So it's one thing to, you like having a full decision amount of minutes with which you can kind of figure out what the favorite is at least going to do. But obviously when you're having these, I don't want to call them low-level matchups, but fights that kind of feel like glorified contender series fights, as a lot of these pairings have been recently. Balaji Oki, Timothy Kwamba comes to mind last week. You want more data usually when you're going to put your confidence in one of these than what's available. And it's going to be a similar story with the next fight I talk about after this, Danny Barlow and Josh Quinlan. But there's a little bit more input on Quinlan there, as well as some history on my end. As for Elliott, this is more of a fade on Woodburn, I think, than it is a play on Elliott. I've seen people kind of speculatively betting Woodburn this week, just because, the line, they'll say the line seems off. But when you hear people say that the line seems off, that they think that there's value, you got to press them a little bit more. It's sometimes merely asking someone why, you'll see their opinion just kind of fall apart, because it's not actually reinforced by something that is tangible to what has actually been seen. It'll just be speculation that kind of floats out there. So I can't make a very, very solid case for Elliott here to be a 300 favorite. Even though I have him graded out to play that, I picked him at 275, and his price has gone up since then, and I think I would still play him in the 300 range. If I'm doing that, it's not because I have this overwhelming confidence that he's going to get it done. What I'm more looking at this is Val Woodburn is coming off of a first-minute loss, albeit on short notice, but a first-round, first-minute loss nonetheless. The first knockout of his career, the first time he's tasted defeat. And this is a fighter who very, very short while ago was competing at light heavyweight. And I wonder if that was a short notice case too, because he only took one fight at light heavyweight. And if you go and look at Tapology, he actually weighed in, I believe, at around 196 pounds, so nearly 10 pounds below what the limit actually is. But you're talking about a guy that was fighting up at that weight and presumably, had cut weight to, or maybe not cut weight because the limit was, again, 205 and he was under it, but a guy that is now making his debut at welterweight that was previously fighting at 25 pounds heavier than what he is. And I think back to the Michael Johnson fight last week, in which part of the reason I felt good about picking him was because Darius Flowers not only was, I thought, a much lower level talent than what Johnson had displayed over a much longer and successful UFC career, but Darius Flowers was debuting at lightweight last week after mostly competing at welterweight and then previously even really being more at middleweight. So, and he also had a handful of knockout losses on his record in boxing matches. So given all of those red flags of being earlier in his career, stuff that Johnson hadn't necessarily had to deal with, and Johnson's really only been knocked out by, truly heavy hitters, at least prior to the knockout that he suffered last year that kind of derailed the momentum that he had since returning to the cage. there was a lot more reason to be optimistic about Johnson than there was about speculatively. God, I don't know why I keep fumbling that word tonight. Speculatively betting Darius Flowers. And I think there's a similar situation here relative to Woodburn's cut. This is a guy that has not fought at welterweight before, and this is a guy who just got knocked out at middleweight inside the first minute. So I don't necessarily think that Elliott is ripe for knocking out Woodburn here, but I do think that there's enough concern about Woodburn's chin now that he's been dropped within the first minute of his last fight and is now taking 15 pounds off of his chin to compete at this weight class and doesn't necessarily have any athletic advantages in this further than being a much shorter, compact fighter for this weight class. Or not for this weight class, but at least just when you're looking at the height of these two guys. Woodburn it's presumably going to be easier for him to find Elliott's chin than for Elliott to do it the other way around. But just because of the big cut that Woodburn is going to have, it'll be interesting to see if he wins the fight on the scale first, makes 170, and then from there, the trade-off that you look at with all of these weight classes is the more that you add weight, you get worried about cardio, and the more weight that you take off, you get worried about chin. So if this does go the distance, when I was looking at this earlier in the week, I thought about taking the plus 2.5 at plus odds. And at the time that I was looking at it, it was at plus 150. And I believe that it had since come down to plus 130. So I kind of wish that I had put that out, especially because I've only got one other underdog I'm putting on this card. But I wanted to see how my other analysis was going to go, given a lot of the lines at this point have kind of gone out to 2-1 range, which for parlay building purposes can make things kind of difficult. So Elliott, again, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking Woodburn's just in a more difficult spot, and I think the line is appropriate because of that. And Elliott is a guy that has gone both. The other thing about being interested in taking the over on the rounds in this is that a common trend that you see with guys that aren't, you don't necessarily want to call them hype machines, but as they start to face tougher competition, as they continue to rise in their careers in MMA, you start to see less of a trend of finishes and more of a trend of them going to decision as they encounter opponents that are more up to their skill level and can give them resistance that they haven't necessarily seen before. That's absolutely been the case for both of these fighters. Woodburn, prior to losing to Nickel, had gone to 2 decisions for the first time in his MMA career. I believe one of which was the fight that he took at 205 that he ended up losing. And Elliott also has been on a train of decisions, even including his most recent appearance on Contender Series. So you look at that, that makes me think that because both of these guys are even if you're worried about how Woodburn is going to deal with the weight cut and taking weight off the chin after coming off a knockout loss, you still wonder if he's high enough of a caliber that he's able to kind of survive Elliott and drag this out to a decision. Just because I don't have enough data on Woodburn, I decided to just kind of go with the favorite here. I kind of wish I had put out that plus 2.5, but by the time I got to the end of the card, I realized I only had one underdog and I already had Elliott already put out as a pick. So it is what it is. I don't think I'm going to be leaning on Elliott for, any parlays here. Again, I've already got another pick that's out in the 300 range on this that I feel much more confident about, and I'll get to that later than Elliott here. But I do expect Elliott to win a decision. I don't think that he's going to be able to put Woodburn out, but I don't think it's necessarily out of the question just because Woodburn, again, is dealing with that big cut. Now, the nice thing about playing that plus 2.5 is that if Woodburn ends up surprising and, Elliott does have a little, this is what dissuaded me from picking the plus 2.5 was that I do think that there's upside for Woodburn to find a knockout here on Elliott, just because we've seen him knocked out twice in the second round of fights in his MMA career, which for a lot of these rising prospects into the UFC, you haven't necessarily seen guys that have been finished multiple times, particularly by knockout. And that's a bit of an uncommon thing that just makes you kind of concerned about how's their chin going to hold up against someone who is going to have a presumably easier path to finding it and hurting them than I think maybe what Elliott would. But Elliott, I think, overall demonstrated more well-rounded MMA skills than what Woodburn did in his brief appearance, and has, double the experience going the distance, albeit it's 4 fights versus 2, but he's still on a train of decisions where you feel good about that. So I, slight lean to the finishing upside for Elliott, even though I think Woodburn has some there too. If it does go to decision, I would expect Elliott to get it. That is the way that I think it's going to go. I don't necessarily think this is going to be an exciting first fight, but again, we don't have a lot of data on Woodburn yet, and we didn't really get to see him very long against Nichols, so maybe he'll be able to surprise some folks here. But again, I'd rather than go with a speculative dog that we've seen 40 seconds of cage time, I would rather go with the guy that was able to earn his contract, if you want to call it that. I can't recall if he actually got the contract on that 90 fought on Contender Series, but again, they were handing those things out like free candy last season. So it was kind of an Oprah situation where Dana was like, you get a contract and you get a contract. So I think Elliott puts on a good showing here, but I don't necessarily rule out that Woodburn could pull off something crazy. But again, don't speculative bet. If you're looking for plus odds on this, go with fight goes the distance, because these guys, that's what the recent trend these two have shown between each other. The next fight is Danny Barlow and Josh Quinlan. I remember picking Quinlan. I felt pretty good about him beating Trey Waters last year, and that was another fight, much like Devin Clark and Marcin Prachnio, where you pick the favorite and the underdog ends up winning a 30-27 decision. Obviously different circumstances and different weight classes, but that fight lives in my memory just because of how disappointed I was in what Quinlan was able to put out. I remember one of the things that made me feel pretty good about him was that in his first 2 appearances with UFC, I believe he might have initially debuted on Contender Series. That's correct. He had a no contest on Contender Series. I believe got overturned. Might have been related to PEDs, if memory serves correct. But this was a guy that had less than 3 minutes of octagon time back when I made that call, which is funny comparing it to Barlow, who enters this 7-0 and off of a first round Contender Series win. So this is a case where you kind of have to exercise some caution in terms of thinking about, is this guy a front runner or not? Now, Barlow's at least got 2 decision wins on his record, so that has to make you feel a little bit better about where this could potentially go. By comparison, Quinlan does not have any wins by decision in his career, and the first time he had actually gone the distance was in his last fight, in which he lost to Trey Waters. So not a good third round performer, at least by that standard, even though he did have a pair of third round finishes prior to joining up on Contender Series. I will say there's a narrative coming into this that both guys are, heavy hitters, and I would just exercise caution that I do actually believe that Quinlan is going to have the power upside here. The bigger issue that I see is that Quinlan did not react well to facing the reach disadvantage that he had against Waters in the last fight. And granted, Waters is like freaky massive for welterweight. The guy is 6'5" and had a 77-inch reach, so Quinlan was dealing with a 5-inch reach discrepancy there. But the interesting thing is when you look at over long period of time where reach actually becomes significant and then extremely significant, the edge for fighters really starts around at like 2.5 inches of reach or greater, which is exactly what Volkanovski is going to have over Ilia Topuria in the main event. But where you start to see the most significant success in terms of consistency relative to reach advantage is when you get to 1/2 foot or greater. And so Quinlan wasn't necessarily dealing with that in the last fight, even though Waters also had 5 inches of height, which probably made it even more difficult and daunting for him to figure out the striking puzzle. But Barlow's got a very atypical reach or is going to have an atypical 7-inch reach advantage for fighting in this weight class, which I think based on what Quinlan had to deal with in the last matchup, and given that he doesn't have much of an MMA record prior to the UFC, you have to wonder about his own level of competition relative to Barlow's, and has he had to face opponents that have offered similar problems beforehand, and did him encountering that disadvantage for the first time in his last fight, was that what left him so baffled to the point that he couldn't even take a single round off of Trey Waters? We saw him get a little bit desperate and I think shoot a few takedowns, and he might have been able to land one. But the only drawback I've really heard about Barlow this week is that there are some people that are speculative that he hasn't really improved his ground game since encountering a bit of a scare in what I believe was one of his decision wins. He ended up surviving a rear naked choke in that case. But if you're speculatively betting on Quinlan, or I wouldn't call it speculative, but the guy's got 2 rear naked chokes on his record, but we haven't seen him be able to take folks down in the UFC. And for the amount of shots that he's taken, his takedown accuracy is only 12%. And it's not, if Barlow is making advantage of or taking advantage of and implementing his reach to keep the distance and utilize what is a very good and dangerous set of kicks that he has, you wonder how accurate Quinlan's shots are going to actually be in terms of getting in on takedowns and putting that fight in where it would presumably be most advantageous to him. I don't expect Danny Barlow to be landing 12 strikes per minute the way that, the numbers are representing as he did in his win on Contender Series that he won inside of 90 seconds. But what I do expect is the guy is going to be able to use the reach, the significant, truly significant reach advantage that he has in this case that his opponent struggled with last fight, to keep the fight on his terms. And the longer this goes, the more that you have to like Barlow, because he is proven we've only seen 3 fights go to decision between these two, and they've only got 14 MMA appearances between them, excluding the no contest that Quinlan had. So you have to like Barlow's chances the longer this goes, just because he's actually been able to experience success with the judges where Quinlan has not. I think Quinlan is knockout or bust here, and the further the fight gets out from the first round, the more difficult it becomes for that to happen. So I think Barlow's a pretty good pick here. I wish that he hadn't floated out to the 200 range as he did shortly after I graded him to win and put out the pick this week. That's probably going to deter me from throwing him confidently into any significant parlays, but I do think if you're looking at the two favorites that are coming off of their Contender Series wins between Barlow and Elliott, even though Elliott's got the longer or the more expensive price tag because the market is more confident in him, I still think that based on what we've seen Quinlan struggle with, that Barlow's a more difficult matchup for him, and for that reason, he's going to be a better play for the first two men's fights than Elliott would be. So I'm taking Danny Barlow to win. I will say that he gets it done by decision. It's possible, I would say, even that maybe he loses the first round as Quinlan is maybe able to implement stronger power, but we've seen Barlow go down the stretch and be able to eke out decision wins under difficult circumstances. He's reacted better to adversity than Quinlan has. So I think that if both fighters are able to kind of put themselves in that position where they're dealing with something that maybe because of their level of confidence they didn't necessarily expect, Barlow's going to be able to grind himself more effectively out of that than what we saw from Quinlan based on his last appearance. So give me Danny Barlow to win. I'll say it goes to decision, but I wouldn't be surprised if he finishes Quinlan in one of the first two rounds either. The next fight is Marcos Rogerio de Lima and Justin Tafa. Rogerio de Lima enters 21-10-1, coming off of one of the more devastating knockouts of last year, one that cost me my winning streak of events, actually, that had dated back to June of last year. That insane run that I went on ended when Derek Lewis caught Rogerio de Lima with a flying knee. A lot of people were on Rogerio de Lima as a 2-1 favorite that night, and it was rather shocking to see him lose in the way that he did. If you look at his post-fight reaction when they were raising Derek Lewis's hand, you can see he's mortified with himself. He's not entirely sure what just happened or what took place. A very, very rattling moment for that guy, and no pun intended, because it's obviously been made, or there's been controversy made of his post-fight comments in which he alluded to the fact that he said his teeth were loose for not just in the immediate aftermath, but for days after the fight where eating solid foods had been difficult. That's just kind of the power that Derek Lewis has, man. And Tafa, I mean, you don't want to say the guy has Derek Lewis power, but, I mean, the guy is a heavyweight, and he hits obviously hard. You saw it in the Austin Lane fight, and you saw it against Parker Porter, too, last year. But it's important to remember that this guy has not nearly had the tenure in the UFC that someone like Rogerio de Lima has, and that he didn't appear at all in 2022. Before resurfacing last year. And even though the guy is supposedly in prime fighting age at 30, for a lot of the other heavyweights at this class, especially the ones that are pushing the 265 limit, he definitely does not have at least the visible athleticism that you would necessarily say that some other guys have. Even at 38 years old, I would say that de Lima is in better shape at this stage than Tafa is. But both guys are obvious. It's a heavyweight fight. Both guys are going to have the power. I would still think that you probably lean towards Tafa for the knockout upside, even though both of these guys have been finished, knocked out in the first round of their careers. It's important to remember that Tafa in his UFC debut did get knocked out by Yorgan de Castro, who has since gone on to be a sparring buddy of John Jones and has kind of fallen out of the UFC. But de Lima's a guy that I have always, since I started doing this, I viewed very fondly in terms of his ability to retain top control and just have which is not something you typically see these more sophisticated ground games from heavyweights. So you definitely, as a capper, just as a broad rule, you want to lean on guys that have the more well-rounded mixed martial arts skill set, because again, for where I'm looking at things in terms of being results oriented and breaking it up into those 3 tiers I alluded to earlier on the podcast of knockout upside, submission upside, decision upside. De Lima, even though wrestling is a very, very strong, or at least earlier in his career was a strong facet of what he would implement to be successful in fights, it gets harder and harder to do that the older that you get. But even if that doesn't become a big thing in this fight, he's demonstrated enough strategy and other tools in his belt to be able to lean on those skills without necessarily wrestling to win fights even at his older age. Now, going back a little bit, I did think that the Blagoy-Ivanov fight was a bad decision. I thought Rogerio de Lima should have won and did enough to win down the stretch, and it really bothered me. And again, I was at UFC 274. I saw Ivanov commit one of the most blatant, over-the-top fence grabs you've ever seen at the end of that fight and get away with it, not get penalized for it at all. And I was stunned that the decision wasn't even split. I really did feel that Ivanov had not really done enough to win that fight further than kind of, walling and stalling, where de Lima, it seemed like he was doing more activity and probably should have been rewarded for that, and finished the third round in the more dominant position, even if he didn't necessarily have enough time to do enough with the takedown at the end of it. Submitted Andrei Arlovsky after a very nice club and sub, but what impresses me, the most impressive performance that he had within the last 2 years, I think certainly had to be the Waldo Cortez Acosta fight. That night I made him a parlay leg, and I didn't end up having a winning event that night because I think I had Ricky Simone over Song Yadong as a parlay leg that night as well, but I remember feeling very good about how I graded the Cortez Acosta and de Lima fight because I figured that de Lima was going to lean on the wrestling because Cortez Acosta didn't have his ground game tested very much. But the interesting thing that happened was that de Lima actually leaned on his leg kicks to take away the, people talk about how Cortez Acosta used to be, I believe, a pitcher in baseball. So if you want to talk about having a fastball in terms of a crisp jab that could have done some damage to de Lima, de Lima came out and went super, super heavy on the leg kicks in a way that immediately compromised Cortez Acosta to where he wasn't going to be super comfortable in the beginning leaning on that. The damage was very apparent, and then when he tried to implement his wrestling in the second round, he recognized that he wasn't going to be able to keep Cortez Acosta down very long, or it was just going to end up gassing him out as the much older fighter as they were preparing to go into the third round. So de Lima made a very, very good strategic decision in the heat of the moment to not lean on something that he knew he could have success with, but was probably going to end up being more of a detriment to him down the stretch if he wasn't able to get a finish. And that decision proved very crucial because he did end up losing the third round to Cortez Acosta, but at that point, he had already banked the first 2 rounds in obvious enough fashion where the goal merely became to survive. Cortez Acosta had suffered enough leg damage at that point that he wasn't really to fully take advantage of his power, which is often the case with any fight that gets out beyond the first round. And de Lima was able to get a unanimous decision in that night. So it was a great performance from him, and that kind of great strategy, something that we haven't necessarily seen from Derek Lewis at any point, made me feel very good about making him a leg again against Derek Lewis, and he just kind of got caught by a meme flying knee. So here we are again, and I see most of what the speculation on Tafa is that he's just going to be able to take advantage of de Lima's, totally destroyed chin. But the interesting thing is that was the first time in his career. The bigger problem de Lima has had, interestingly, is just kind of giving up with, like, being put down on the ground on his own right and submitting to other guys. Tafa does not have any sort of submission ability offensively in his MMA career in terms of what he's demonstrated. So the submission upside in this case exclusively has to belong to De Lima if he is able to get Tafa down and just kind of smother him and be, the stronger, more athletically gifted person. I don't expect him to be able to do that in later rounds, but the problem is we just haven't really seen Tafa have any success in, stages of fights that go beyond the second round. Losing a unanimous decision to Jared Vanderaa is super, super bad. The split decision with Carlos Felipe in a lot of ways is bad too, but given the trajectory of Jared Vandeera's career in the UFC, that was not a good loss to have, particularly after he was able to hurt Vanderaa early but wasn't able to put him away. So you wonder what could happen in this fight if Tafa, even if he ends up taking the first round, if he isn't immediately able to put away De Lima, how is that going to affect his performance in the last 10 minutes? And is a guy who has shown good in-fight strategy and decision-making and kind of altering game plan on the fly in the way that De Lima has, how is that going to play out over the last 10 minutes? And when you look at just the numbers by themselves, you see that De Lima has gone to 3 times as many decisions as Tafa has. And in those cases, he has won at a 67% rate in the final round compared to just 25% for Tafa. In that case, I am loosely figuring that he had an okay performance against Felipe down the stretch of that fight. But again, this is a guy that has not won by decision once in his career. And you just saw De Lima in a fight where he was going up against a pronounced age gap in Cortez Acosta, was able to out veteran, if you want to call it that, in the same way that people were kind of saying vet move that Hermanson pulled on Pfeiffer last week. De Lima was able to do that against Cortez Acosta last year. And I think that a similar case is going to happen here. I think this is a heavyweight fight, so you have to figure that the fight ending in the first half is the more optimal path, but I think both guys are live to knock each other out because Tafa's chin isn't necessarily made of iron, as we saw in the De Castro fight. We know De Lima's coming off one of the more devastating knockout losses of 2023, so there's obviously knockout risk for them here as well, and it's a heavyweight fight. But otherwise, all the submission upside belongs to De Lima, and all of the decision upside belongs to De Lima. So I think that for where this fight is priced, De Lima is an excellent play. And it could be a bit of a better live betting opportunity, particularly if Tafa has a successful first round but isn't able to put De Lima away. I think that you might at that point want to look at betting De Lima live, especially if he's kind of had a rough go of it in the first round, but again is going to have, and Tafa's starting to look tired or winded in his corner after going back after the opening 5 minutes and not being able to put him away. But I do really like De Lima in this spot, and on a week where I've only got about 8 picks and a lot of these lines have already raced out to like the 200 range anyway, I think by default I'm going to have to make him a leg again. It's bitten me before, but it's also rewarded me. And I think that this is a good match. I think this is a good bounce back matchup for him. And that if he weathers that early storm through the opening, 2 minutes, this is going to look more and more like the fight that De Lima wants on his terms. So give me De Lima. I'm going to say that he gives Tafa his first submission loss of his career. And I'll say it happens in the second round as opposed to the first. The next fight is Anthony Hernandez and Roman Kopylov. Hernandez enters 11-2, coming off an impressive smothering of Edmund Shabazian in the co-main event. I believe it was the co-main event back in May of last year of UFC Fight Night Dern versus Hill. That was a fairly successful event for yours truly. I believe that was the night memory serves me correctly, that Themba Garimbo beat Takashi Sato. That is correct. That was one of my best events of last year. I picked Themba Garimbo and Chase Hooper as underdogs that night. Chase Hooper was an underdog against Nick Fiore. Can you believe that? And he won 30-26 on one of the scorecards. That was a great event for me. I didn't quite get a clean sweep, I don't think, but I had a very, very overall successful event. Picked some great winners that night. Glad to see Rodrigo Nascimento beat Ilir Latifi by split, and Vyacheslav Borshev had that great finish over Maheshate as well. So lots of stuff to like from that card. But I thought what was easily the most impressive out of everything was the way that Hernandez was able to smother Shabazian. I remember as the second round ended thinking, okay, I just need Hernandez to, survive to the end to get, for me to have a really good night. And he ended up going the extra mile and getting that late third round finish, recognizing that Shabazian didn't really have much left for him at that point. And, what he did to Shabazian is something that we've seen happen to Kopylov before. It's really easy to forgive his performance against Albert Duraev, in which unbelievably Duraev closed as a -400 favorite. I mean, that is just truly shocking given the ascendance that Kopylov has had since. But again, you look at the fighters that he's faced during that stretch, Alessio Di Chirico, who had already been kind of recognized as chinny at that point, Punahele Soriano, who has since, kind of not really worked out in the UFC. Claudio Ribeiro ended up, I thought Ribeiro gave some good pushback at the end of that first round that kind of gets thrown out because of how quickly he got kicked in the head after the second round began. But that fight was, I think, more even than it traditionally gets represented as. Ribeiro just didn't have tight enough striking defense and got bit really hard on Kopylov's feint to find defeat there, which, again, that's one of the best things Kopylov does, is that even though he's not really a big combination guy, you're rarely going to see him throw more than 3 strikes in succession, but because the guy is so accurate and sharp with his with picking his spots, he does a good job of throwing a volume of 1-2s, and his hand speed's very quick, and he invests in a lot of body work, which is why you only see one first round finish on his record, actually, which I think is very interesting for what the strategy is probably going to look like for Hernandez here. Now you compare that to Hernandez, and he had a flurry of first-round finishes prior to getting to the UFC, and then ended up picking up a 5-round unanimous decision over Brendan Allen in 2018. So he's had a bit of a roller coaster ride in his own regard relative to a lot of momentum when he came in, no contest on Contender Series, actually lost by submission in Brazil to Marcus Perez, which is not a great loss to have, but bounced back by submitting Junyon Park, which a lot of people, including, a grappling specialist like Andre Muniz, wasn't even able to get done, before eating too many knees from Kevin Holland, getting knocked out, but since bouncing back and ripping off a 4-fight win streak of his own, which included one of the most significant betting upsets of the last 3 years, in which he, I believe, was like a plus 500 underdog to Rodolfo Vieira, and still, just because Vieira didn't really manage his gas tank well and had kind of a difficult weight cut, I think, Fluffy came in and just completely outclassed him with the cardio and was able to get a second-round submission. So you've multiple late-round the second-round submission. Well, he has multiple submissions in the UFC in the second half of fights against high-level opponents, including Junyon Park and Marc-Andre Barriault, and that's not even including the submission he got in the first half of the fight against someone as credentialed as Rodolfo Vieira. So you really have to like a lot of what he's been able to demonstrate in the last since getting knocked out by Kevin Holland. And I don't think that you can look at this and even remotely question between him and Kopylov who's had the higher level of competition here. And I think that's important for evaluating where this fight is potentially going to go, because if Kopylov does more investment in body work as he's typical of doing in the opening rounds, is that necessarily going to have an effect on Hernandez's cardio, who we've already seen proven can fight at this alarming wrestling heavy pace for 5 rounds when he needs to, even against guys with much better ground game than what Kopylov has demonstrated? The interesting thing, and I'm willing to forgive the Roberson fight because it was his UFC debut and it was in 2019 at this point, but the Duraev fight was only 3 years ago. And when you go back and watch that fight in Abu Dhabi, the interesting thing that stands out is Kopylov was in, like, Jason Herzog did not let him off the hook for very blatant fence grabbing that was preventing Albert Duraev's initial takedown attempts. And when Herzog finally stopped the fight, granted Duraev back the position and resumed the fight, Duraev recognized that he needed to just shoot and go immediately, or not shoot, he was already in the clinch at that point, but needed to get his double leg implemented quickly and just put him on the ground because he knew at that point that he wasn't going to be able to get back up, which is exactly what happened. And Duraev, on I think at least one card or possibly multiple cards, got a 10-8 round out of that after he put Kopylov on the ground, despite the fact that Kopylov got a knockdown at the beginning of the second round. And Kopylov came out of that second round looking very, very similar to how Edmund Shabazian did after Fluffy Hernandez drowned him in Anthony's last appearance in the previous year. Now, I think that's important because if this fight does get to the third round, I mean, Kopylov did get the third round from Duraev, I believe, on the scorecards, but there were several bad body language instances in which Kopylov just kind of blatantly stopped fighting and put his hands on his knees to recover because he had already been busted open at that point and looked bad. Duraev was wearing, his damage in his own right, but both guys were tired at the end, but Kopylov's body language was far, far worse than what you saw from Duraev. And I think that's important when you're looking at this because Kopylov has only gone the distance twice, and while that may be true for Hernandez, we've seen far more encouraging work when Hernandez has gone to decision, particularly given the way that he fights, than Kopylov exclusively relying on his striking, no matter how sniper-like it may be. So when I look at this and I see the lack of first-round finishes for Kopylov, and I think about how Hernandez very much has a drown you out as the fight continues to go on style, it really makes me think that Kopylov here is going to have less success as the fight goes on and is going to need to go for that first round finish the same way that Kevin Holland kind of flew out of the gate and got one. But we just haven't seen him do that. And if he does come out of the gate flying, Hernandez is going to have opportunities in space where he's going to be able to break Kopylov's takedown defense despite how good it may look at 92%. And again, you know that a lot of that is aided by fence grabbing that he was able to get away with even in the Duraev fight. One thing I think is particularly unfortunate that we've seen of late is that fights that get stopped due to fouls from fence grabbing or groin shots or whatever, we haven't seen refs rewarding fighters that have earned that position getting it back. The most obvious example I can remember was when Davey Grant fought Rafael Asunção, I believe, last year. And that the blunder by the ref not doing that ended up costing Rafael Asunção a decision win in his retirement, and he ended up getting finished at the end by, I think it was like reverse triangle choke or something that Davey Grant pulled off. So I worry that Kopylov is going to get away with fence grabbing in a way that might deter Hernandez more from having more success than he would otherwise in this fight. But the 6 6.79 takedowns per 15 minutes for Hernandez is more than what Merab Dvalishvili averages. And Merab has far less efficient takedown accuracy than Hernandez. Hernandez is landing over 2 takedowns per round at a greater than on greater than 50% of his attempts. That is remarkably efficient and effective wrestling. And that's the kind of wrestling that would break even strong takedown defense from Kopylov. And I don't like the way that Kopylov, he let Duraev exist and mount, I think, far longer than what he's going to be able to allow for Hernandez to deal with. But he did a good job from defending at the bottom and spent a long time not conceding his back, but ultimately did in a way that Duraev wasn't really able to take advantage of beyond getting a 10-8. If he gives up his back to Hernandez at any point in this fight, he's in deep shit. And I think that is what's going to end up happening down the stretch at some point. I'm going to say that Kopylov puts on the more impressive work in the first round, but that Hernandez is gradually able to make his reads based on the data that he gets in the first round and the input and the reads that he's making, is able to avoid taking any seriously compromising damage, eventually gets Kopylov down on the ground in the second round, puts a lot of damage on him in the same way that Duraev was able to, and then ultimately, because his cardio is in a much better position than Kopylov's is, gets another third round submission. So I like Hernandez a lot here. Great decision upside, great submission upside. Kopylov's going to have the knockout upside here, but again, this is the rare fighter that, for how much of a sniper he is, the guy only has 1 first-round knockout out of the 11 on his record, and 11 of his 12 wins have come by knockout. So I think you very much have to like Hernandez here, particularly as a native of Durango, California, which not very close to Anaheim and, extremely inland area, definitely not the parts of California you typically think of relative to San Francisco and the other coastal cities. But the guy is California native, true and true, fighting a Russian in Anaheim. The crowd is going to be all the way on his side, going crazy the moment he finally gets that takedown and is putting damage on Kopylov from top position. And I think that is eventually going to break Kopylov in a way that Hernandez gets an impressive finish. And I hope that they give him a bit better of a matchup or another ranked opponent after this, because there's speculation from other sharps in this space that I very much respect that this guy, Fluffy Hernandez, with the style that he has, is going to be a problem for a lot of fighters. And I absolutely agree with that assessment. I don't like that his price had floated out to 210 by the time that it was ready for me to pick him this week. But Fluffy Hernandez is one of the most complete guys in this weight class that you're going to see. And I think that he'll be able to give Kopylov a lot more resistance in the striking, even if he doesn't have the advantages there, than Kopylov is going to be able to give him on the ground. So give me Fluffy Hernandez by third round submission. The next fight is Merab Dvalishvili and Henry Cejudo, Triple C, the king of cringe, who definitely earned that nickname based on that video he recorded with his coach. I mean, come on, man. I hope that wasn't real. And then he followed it up with what one journalist in the press conference called the weirdest thing I've heard you say, when he said, "I don't kiss and tell, but I'll let you smell," in response to whether that video was legit or not, which, what is going on, man? I'm going to make this one quick because I think this fight is much more interesting just from like a narrative perspective than it's actually going to be fight-wise. I've never seen this much enthusiasm over a decision merchant the way that we've seen everyone fawning over Merab in the last couple of years. It's particularly interesting because this guy Merab has not fought more than 2 times in the last 2 years. And, it's so fascinating to me that I listened to Sherdog's breakdown of this fight this week from Ben Duffy and Keith Schillen. And Ben Duffy inexplicably made the point that, like, Dvalishvili was able to break Aldo, who had great takedown defense in that fight. You go back and look at the stats. I don't know if you remember. That fight was terrible. It was a 15-minute wall install in which Dvalishvili did not land a single takedown. And that was the last fight we got from Jose Aldo in the UFC. It's such a disappointing way for such a great fighter's career to end with the promotion. We hardly got to see Aldo do anything just because he was put up against the fence for 15 minutes. Now everybody's fawning over the Jan performance, in which Dvalishvili, I think, inexplicably shot 49 takedown attempts and landed 11 of them. So yeah, he won 50-45, and everybody is, making the point that, oh, he's going to fight at this crazy pace that Cejudo's not going to be able to handle. And I think that there's, a case for that he's going to be able to beat Cejudo at his own game in a certain sense. But this is a guy in Cejudo that, in the eyes of at least one judge, beat Aljamain Sterling 3 years off the couch. Off the couch is extreme at this, way to put it, because obviously he got the full camp in and everything before he took that fight. But Cejudo was carrying more ring rust in that than in hardly any other matchup I've graded in the time that I've been doing this, and admitted in his post-fight interview that it affected him in the earlier rounds to the point that he gave up the opening 2 rounds on 2 of the judges' scorecards, and that ended up costing him the fight. But Cejudo, I think, is unquestionably going to be the more well-rounded guy here. It's just that Merab, how much is he going to be able to weaponize the pace and the cardio, and and more than that, what is he, when he does actually get Cejudo down, as opposed to getting mat returns, is he going to be able to do something effective with the top control and the control time that he gets and retain dominant position against a guy in Cejudo that has the full well-rounded skill set? Neither of these guys are submission threats. And Cejudo has very limited knockout upside that I think is more limited to his leg kicks than any actual striking or punching he's going to have at this stage. And we know that Merab is a decision merchant, because the only knockout that he has in recent memory was against Marlon Moraes, who actually was able to put the hurt on Merab in the earlier stages of their fight before Merab was able to come back and find a finish of his own. I think we're going to get a very boring, glorified wrestling match, and that could end up meaning Dvalishvili gets a 30-27 with another wall install like what he got against Aldo, or Cejudo could end up turning the tables in a way that we don't really expect. Maybe he's able to make more of an impression with the judges with more impactful striking in the opening 2 rounds than what Dvalishvili is able to put together as he tries chaining together takedowns and mat returns and doesn't end up doing a lot of damage with all this wrestling that he does. I think it's certainly possible, especially based on the fact that Cejudo's not going to have nearly as much of a layoff this time as he did against Sterling, and against a fighter in Sterling that's arguably better than Merab, certainly has higher finishing upside than Merab. If Cejudo gets a full camp and has a comparable layoff to what he did in the last fight, does that end up being a decision that goes the way of Cejudo as opposed to a split for Aljamain? Now, obviously, Sterling and Dvalishvili being very, very tight buddies, I'm sure that Dvalishvili has consulted Sterling to a certain extent about what Cejudo is like in the cage and drawing advice in that respect. And I'm not sure if he's actually going to be cornering Merab or not, but you would imagine that's going to play a very significant difference maker in favor of Merab. But it's just hard for me to get behind betting this guy at 2-1, given that so much of this is probably coming down to a decision. And Cejudo is going to be the California guy here. So I would think the crowd is going to be on his side, and that could make an impression with the judges, even if, the fans really do love Merab. I think that there's more of I think the UFC wins either way based on how this fight plays out, because the winner's probably going to get a title shot against O'Malley, assuming O'Malley beats Chito Vera. But you would much rather see, I think, Cejudo and O'Malley for the press run for that, as opposed to Dvalishvili, even though Merab has that one of the funniest post-fight moments in years when he stole Sean O'Malley's jacket, I believe, after the Aljamain Sterling Cejudo fight. So I think the plus 2.5 rounds, even though it's at a worse price than what you get for Merab here, is the far, far safer bet, just because there's no submission threat really from either of these guys. And you if you're worried about one of them getting knocked out, you're probably more worried about Cejudo. But based on the fact that Cejudo was able to survive against a more potent finishing threat with more ring rust attached in Sterling, you would think that he's going to be able to get to the distance here against Merab, and that Merab is going to go to a decision again for what would be the that would be like what, the 1, 2, 3. It'd be the 9th time in his last 10 fights. So I'm very, very much looking at the. I need to see what the odds come out to on, Friday, when I actually lock stuff in after the weigh-ins. But if I'm looking at a situation where I can't find 3 picks I want to parlay and need to get a 4th one in just to kind of bump me up to the point where I can do a 3 or a 3.5 unit risk to get to 10, I'm looking at this and thinking this has to be easy money, even if the juice is already way in on it. So take fight goes the distance here. Much less risky play than banking on Merab at a 2-1 favorite against a former UFC champion. I know it worked out when he fought Aldo, but Cejudo, I think at this point, has a little bit more left in the tank, especially based on what we saw in that Sterling fight, than what Aldo had when they fought back in August of 2022. So I'll say Merab wins by decision, but I won't be surprised if Cejudo leaves a lot of people stunned and people questioning why they were so heavily enamored with a decision merchant to begin with. The next fight is Garry and Geoff Neal. Now, some people, at least one person, but I'm sure more than just one person particularly, are, if not confused, then at least surprised that I was willing to take Luque over Garry when they were set to fight a short while ago. That fell through. I jokingly called it a spiritual victory because there was some controversy surrounding Garry pulling out with supposed illness on fight week. Those people are surprised that I'm taking Garry at 2-1 to beat Geoff Neal, but was on Luque the last time around. But it's important to recognize that Luque and Geoff Neal are not identical fighters. They do things differently, and I would go further to say that in terms of just sheer well-roundedness, that Luque, who has more UFC experience than Geoff Neal, a slew of higher finishes, and had just been coming off a main event decision win over Rafael Dos Anjos, had much less of a layoff than Geoff Neal has going into this one, And there are a lot of things that I like about Luque as a fighter that I don't like about Geoff Neal, which is one of the things that prompted me to pick Luque to beat Neal, as many did when they fought back in 2022. Obviously, Neal was able to hurt Luque in a way that kept him on the shelf for quite a little bit and ended up being arguably the best performance of Neal's career. But we haven't seen Geoff Neal for 11 months. And in his last fight, if you'll recall, he actually came in about 3 pounds over the welterweight limit when he matched up with Shavkat Rakhmonov. Now, some people were speculating that was a somewhat intentional miss, trying to make himself heavier or not as dehydrated so that he would have had a better chance to contend with Shavkat and wouldn't be as easy to hold on the cage or hold down or what have you. I can't really get into that more than just recognizing the fact that the guy missed weight when we last saw him 11 months ago, and so there's a bit of weight cut liability that wasn't there for someone like Luque. Garry, I think, seems more with it. At least he's not skipping out on his media week appearance, and he had been looking forward to this pairing previously, before Neal had to pull out of their previous matchup, and I think that's something that merits consideration here too. I just don't see a lot of avenues to victory for Geoff Neal beyond finding Ian Garry's chin early. But even if he is able to do that, we haven't necessarily seen one punch lights out power from Geoff Neal. Even the Luque fight was really more of an accumulation of damage over several rounds as opposed to a singular shot that caused Luque's brain bleed and put him out. Again, if you watch the way that fight ended, the way that Luque was getting hurt was bad, but it was the way that his head hit the canvas, like head first after getting rattled, that was particularly bad, I would imagine, for the injury that he ended up suffering in that. Otherwise, Neal's had a lot of very inconsistent performances and stretches in his UFC career, and if you go back and look at the stretch of success that he has had since being on Contender Series, he fought twice in 2018, he fought 3 times in 2019, and then had a year-long layoff between the Mike Perry and Stephen Thompson fight, in which he lost a unanimous decision in a 5-round fight. Didn't see him again for about 6 months when he lost to Neil Magny, and then had a pretty decent, another about 6-month layoff going into the Ponzinibbio fight that he won by split decision. It took about 7 or 8 months for him to get back before the Luque fight, which ended up being a really good bounce-back performance for him. And then he fought again the following March against Shavkat, and that was his most recent performance. But you see how in that year-long layoff between when he knocked out Mike Perry in the first round and when he lost his main event to Stephen Thompson, you see that he has a history of not dealing with these layoffs well. And that is something that I think merits consideration here, given he's going to have significantly more of a layoff than the last time we saw Ian Garry, despite Ian Garry pulling out of his fight with Luque after beating Neil Magny in August. Gary's got a lot of good momentum here. I think that he's probably going to get ahead on strikes early. It's just going to be a matter of how is he going to be able to protect his head, and is he going to lean on tall man defense? If he ends up frustrating Geoff Neal, I think that it's going to be easy for him to cruise down the stretch to a decision. I don't necessarily think a submission is in play here, even though it would stand to reason. Neal's lost more fights by submission than he has by knockout, so it might stand to reason that Garry should explore that. But we haven't seen Garry really deploy any of his submission ability in the UFC. He's got only one win by rear naked choke on his record, and it came in his third fight. So there's definitely the case for Neal to find Garry's chin here, but I think it's going to have to be on a somewhat like attrition of strikes rather than him just getting one singular shot. Assuming that this fight goes beyond the first round, which I would expect it to. Neal's inconsistency here is what makes me really surprised that so many people are intrigued by the prospect of betting him this week. Conversely, even though he's at 33 years old, which isn't necessarily in the declining stage, we know that Garry, as young as he is still making improvements fight to fight because of how young he is. And between those improvements, he has consistently remained training at world-class camps, whether it be Killcliff FC, now he's since gone to Shootbox, and I can't imagine that that's any less of a drop-off in terms of the level of fighters that he's working and preparing with. And it's better than, I believe, what Geoff Neal is experiencing at he's at Fortis, so Fortis is a good gym too. So I wouldn't necessarily say that. They're both getting good camps, but I think that Garry's probably getting more out of it just because of how young he is in his career and moving up and along. So I would hope that his defense has improved here to the point that he's going to not necessarily just lean on him being the taller guy, because even though the reach is pretty consistent between these two, the fact that Neal profiles as the harder hitter and is going to be 4 inches shorter makes the case that he's going to have an easier time finding Garry's chin than vice versa. But we've seen enough of a good diversity, the range of kicks. Garry, more than anybody, I think that I've seen, utilizes those standing knees to the face in the clinch, even when his opponent is straight upright. He throws those standing knees in the clinch about as well as anybody. So he's got, good flexibility and a good diversity of strikes from, a variety of positions in the cage. I will be concerned. And then the other thing too is that we haven't seen Garry actually get finished yet. The Song Kenan fight, everybody likes to point out that if Kenan had actually, gone for the ground and pound knockout instead of chasing a club and sub after he got the knockdown, that he probably would have gotten a huge upset win there. I don't necessarily disagree, but I think Garry also deserves credit for finding his way back into that fight and then eventually being able to turn the tables, despite the fact that he was this big betting favorite going into it. So if these two encounter adversity in this fight from one or the other, it's similar to what I spoke about in 2 of the previous fights featuring Hernandez and Kopylov, as well as Rogerio de Lima and Justin Tafa. I expect Garry to do a better job of changing his game plan on the fly and doing what and not getting frustrated and doing what he needs to do to find the win. When we've seen Geoff Neal get frustrated, he can just kind of check out and fall apart. And I don't necessarily think that he checked out against Shavkat Rakhmonov, but we've seen it happen against fighters that he should presumably have beaten given where his talent level is at his current career. Neil Magny's an excellent example of that. That is a fighter that we saw Ian Garry pick up a 30-24 over in his last fight. And Magny, traditionally attributed as the gatekeeper of the welterweight division, did gatekeep Geoff Neal in that case from any sort of legitimate rising title contention. So it'll be interesting to see Neal after nearly a year away, but I think that Garry at 2-1 is right about appropriate. I wouldn't necessarily. I'll be curious to see how this line changes as it gets closer to as it gets closer to fight time. And it'll be interesting to see how Neal does on the scale this time after a big weight miss that I think kind of gets lost in the mix of his last appearance. I will say Garry wins a decision here, but I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up suffering a knockdown in the early stage and has to kind of wait his way through adversity to get back. He may not look like a 2-1 favorite early on in the fight, but I think that by the end it's going to be clear that he's the more composed fighter and the one that is better equipped to deal with adversity, given what we've seen from Geoff Neal when the going gets tough. The next fight is Robert Whittaker and Paulo Costa. Whittaker is 25-7, coming off loss to Dricus du Plessis, in which he closed as about a 4-1 favorite, and that was one of my best underdog picks of the year last year. Was Dricus at plus 300. Especially vindicating now that he's gone on to become a champion as of about a month ago. Paulo Costa we have not seen for a year and a half since his bizarre fight with Luke Rockhold, in which he was unable to find a finish despite the fact that he had largely beaten down pretty badly on Rockhold for most of that fight. It was only the, I believe, third time that Costa has gone to a decision in his career, which I think could end up being a pretty significant detriment to his performance here with Whittaker. I think the fight is lined appropriately given the layoff that Costa has had. He says that he's made a lot of improvements with his time away, although we know some of it has been spent dealing with recovery. He was obviously supposed to fight last year before an elbow bursitis injury and subsequent surgery caused him to miss. I believe that was the event in Abu Dhabi or in Saudi Arabia. I'm forgetting where it was at, but I believe he was supposed to fight Chimaev, and then they had to get the late replacement for Kamaru Usman as a result. And of course, this fight has been tried to get a booking a few times in the past, with Costa protesting that he never signed a contract and was not getting enough money in those cases. So the fight wasn't actually happening and ended up falling apart. And here we are, I believe, this is the third time that they've tried to book this and they've finally gotten it. So it seems like everything must be aligned. I trust Costa to not get hurt by, compromisingly so, by really anything Whittaker's going to be throwing at him at this stage. But the thing is, we know that Whittaker fights smart enough and technical enough that's not where Costa thrives. Costa's going to want to make this a brawl, but he doesn't necessarily have the difference between him and Dricus is that we haven't seen the consistent approach of mixing the arts the way that we see Dricus going for takedowns and really doing a good job of making sure that the fight hits all three different stages of the cage in a given round: standing strikes, going to the ground, being up on the fence. Those are all areas in which du Plessis thrives, and he was able to blend those all successfully against Whittaker, which is why I compared the style to the Muddy Waters in terms of trying to get both of them tired. Played out very well against a guy like Whittaker who wants to make it a very clean and technical affair. And I think that he's going to have success in doing so. And Whittaker's defense, I think, is going to be key here too, because if Costa comes out and is just trying to wing haymakers and get that first-round finish, I would expect Whittaker to be able to have some success parrying that and, finding his own counters and just being the more technical overall fighter. And the longer this goes, the more that you have to like it for Whittaker, particularly given he's got 4 times more experience than Costa going the distance and a little bit more success in the final round while doing so. I'm going to take the plus 2.5 here because I can see a situation in which Costa is doing more damage to Whittaker on less strikes. But we've seen better volume from Costa, at least by the numbers, than we have Robert Whittaker. So it is possible that at least in the early going that Costa is maybe able to get ahead if he comes out winging, but I just don't anticipate that happening because he's been away from the cage for a year and a half, and Whittaker knows that the best way to win this fight is not going to be feeding into the brawl that Costa's going to be looking for. I think that Whittaker recognizes that his best path to victory, rather than trying to finish this guy that I believe has only been knocked out by Israel Adesanya, the best path for him is going to be just getting the point fighting going and trying to take at least 2 of the rounds away. And it's possible Whittaker ends up ripping off a 30-27, but if Costa's able to put him down in the first round and then Whittaker battles back and makes it a prettier affair in the second, and you're looking at a situation where it's anybody's fight going into the third round, I would feel more comfortable having a better value ticket on the over on rounds than the under. And you look at the recent history between these two since 2019, and only 3 of their 11 fights haven't met that standard of going beyond 12.5 minutes. And that's as these two, not necessarily Whittaker because he's had a much longer tenured UFC career, but at least with Costa, you see the similar pattern in which I was alluding to in the Oban Elliott and Valentine Woodburn fight, where as these fighters begin to actually meet level of competition that is more parallel with their abilities, you start to see fights get more drawn out and more often than not going to decision, and they gradually begin to string more decisions together. So that's kind of what you've seen with Costa here, even when he's fighting a guy like Luke Rockhold, and who presumably had a much worse chin than Whittaker does even at this stage. And he just wasn't able to get the finish there. And I think he was coming off a pretty fairly high amount of ring rust for that one as well. So I just don't see Whittaker getting a finish on Costa here, and I think that Costa does have more of the finishing upside than Whittaker does, and for that reason, I wouldn't feel comfortable betting Whittaker as a 2-1 favorite, because if he does end up suffering even one knockdown in either of the first 2 rounds, you're looking at a situation where he's going to have to outright win the other 10 minutes by point fighting against a guy that's going to be coming to try to take his head off during that whole stretch. I just would feel more comfortable that if I'm going to take juice on a pick here, I'd rather do it in a way that is with a something closer to pick'em range. And obviously the plus 2.5 is minus 150, so it's not in pick'em range. My point is only to emphasize that the odds are much better on the over here than they are on just taking the Whittaker money line. But taking the Whittaker money line at this price, when you can't really lean on him getting a finish, I just don't think is justified for playing him. So I think that you're much safer taking the over on rounds here. If you're confident in Costa, I think that you should bet him. But again, the layoff I think is very, very significant. And Whittaker is going to be trying to give Costa the opposite of the fight that he wants, that he's going to thrive in. You're not going to see Whittaker try to brawl, especially after what happened with Duplessis. He's going to try to make this pretty. He's going to try to get Costa frustrated. If Costa gets frustrated, you're looking at a situation where he's probably just going to try to not get finished. And I think that that's more conducive to the fight going the distance than it is to making a bet on either one of these money lines. So give me Whittaker by decision, but I won't be surprised if Costa does enough damage in any of 2 of the 3 rounds that he's able to end up sneaking one here. And if he does, you can't give him a title shot off of this fight, but I think that if you're looking for a bounce back for Izzy, an Izzy Costa rematch with no belt on the line is something that I think a lot of people would be interested in. You give Izzy that fight, and then Izzy is able to maybe even get another finish or at least get the win. At that point, I think that you can probably put Izzy in a title fight with Duplessis rather than have him rematch Strickland. And that gives you the main event that they want for UFC Africa. So don't rule out Costa here, but that's why I'm taking the over. But I do think Whittaker should win this. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with Whittaker's trajectory if he does do so. And now we come to the main event. Alexander Volkanovski and Ilia Topuria. Volk is 26-3 coming off of his first round knockout loss to Islam Makhachev. Topuria enters 14-0 following a dismantling of Josh Emmett last year at UFC Jacksonville. So there's been some controversy made about Volkanovski coming back too quickly from being knocked out, and I don't really think that that's the case. You typically want it when I talk about ring rust so much, and I think it's one of the factors that actually gives me an edge in evaluating this, because for some reason there's a lot of people that speculate that it is a myth or doesn't exist. You saw Anthony Smith making that case for Jack Hermanson after the on the UFC post-fight show last weekend, and I keep thinking back to the interview that Cejudo gave after the Aljamain Sterling fight last year at UFC 288, in which he was immediately willing to admit that he thought it compromised his early performance in that fight, that he just had spent a little bit too much time away from the cage. And I think it's particularly true for this sport more than other ones, just because you're not in the fight or flight scenario where your only option is fight in this sport as much as you are in other ones where you don't really have the prospect of getting punched in the face to worry about. But the flip side of that is how much, what is the perfect time away from the cage to have relative to if you've just taken damage, whether it be 15 minutes of getting hit without suffering anything compromising or getting knocked out in the first round. Now you see fighters go on medical suspension if they suffer a particularly gruesome finish or are getting very up there in age, but Volk at 35 we haven't seen him for about 4 months. And I think 3 months is usually the line that I draw for when I think a fighter has spent the perfect amount of time away between their next fight. That's really that's like the perfect amount of time that you want to see for somebody between one appearance and the next, particularly if they won. There's enough time to recover, and then there's time to get a full camp in and, just get prepared mentally and physically for their next matchup, particularly if they're in their prime fighting years. Doesn't always play out that smoothly. I mean, there's, cancellations and other criteria at play, but in most cases, you'd like to see 3 months. And anything out further than that, if a fighter has been, out for an extended stretch relative to their opponent being out shorter, I think it starts to become more and more significant the shorter the layoff of the guy with less ring rust has relative to the longer layoff here. So when you look at the numbers here, Topuria is obviously the guy that is to not necessarily on volume of strikes, but does have the better defensive striking numbers, both from strikes absorbed per minute and just efficiency of strikes defended. He's got much better numbers relative to takedowns, both in how many he's landing per 15 minutes, takedown accuracy, and his own ability to defend takedowns. Much more frequent rate of submission attempts than what we've seen from Volkanovski. But as you start to look at more of the technical aspects, there's a lot of things to like for Volk here. I don't think it's a question that he's going to be getting a better camp with City Kickboxing than Clement Club, which is kind of where Topuria has been his whole career, which hasn't done him wrong yet. But again, we see this with a lot of international fighters that enjoy success, come over to the UFC and then continue to enjoy success, that they really just stay ingrained within what has been comfortable and working for them. They don't necessarily bring themselves over to what could be a more world-class gym. I think a good example of that would be Yuri Prochazka. So I would definitely say that Volk is getting the better camp with City Kickboxing. He's got nearly 3 times more UFC experience overall than Topuria has, and obviously has done nothing but fight truly like true killers and contenders in his recent years. The trilogy with Holloway just being an example. But then you look at the layoff Topuria's had, and we haven't seen him for 8 months. And Volk, I think, to his credit, getting back in, taking that fight with Makhachev on short notice has given him a ring rust layoff of only 4 months here. So he is entering this with 2 times less ring rust than what Topuria is going to have. And that could end up being truly significant in the early stages of this fight. But as you start to look at more of what's available here, I think that there's a little bit more to like for Topuria than what you would like for Volk. I do think that Topuria is going to have to be, if he's going to win this, he's going to have to be the guy that finally figures out, how do I overcome the volume of striking here from Volkanovski, where he's setting up his kicks to throw his punches, and he's just constantly stringing together these 3 strike combos, 4 strike combos, and just doing and getting a read on the excellent footwork that Volkanovski has. There's a lot that Topuria has to do in order to win this fight, but the same can be said for Volkanovski. And I think that when you look at this matchup, I would give the striking edge to Volkanovski, but if you're looking at all of the MMA skills available, I don't know how you can say that at this stage Topuria isn't the more well-rounded guy. Again, breaking into the 3 sections of a way that a fight can end, knockout upside, I would say both of these guys are pretty hard hitters. But because of the volume of striking for Volk, I would probably lean towards him having a little bit more knockout upside than Topuria. We have seen Topuria knocked down in the UFC, and even though Volk's coming off of a first-round knockout loss, you still, I think, have to like Topuria, or you still have to like the striking upside that you're getting with Volkanovski as opposed to a little bit less volume and efficiency with Topuria. However, the submission upside exclusively, I think, belongs to Topuria here. And even though we haven't seen Volk lose by submission yet, and is obviously very, very famously survived that guillotine from Brian Ortega, I think that if you end up seeing the full suite of mixed martial arts implemented here over 25 minutes, which is more than reasonable to expect because it's a title fight, Topuria is going to have the upside with getting takedowns and making an impression with the control that he has, and just keep it. The best way to mitigate Volk's footwork is to just not let him move around the cage, and that's going to require good shots and setups. But the thing is, he's been fighting. He's got 2 losses now against a guy in Makhachev that I thought probably gave pretty good tape on how Topuria can end up setting up his entries. So I don't know how you look at the numbers and then the recent performances from Volk and conclude that he's going to have the upside with wrestling here. I think that's definitely going to go to Topuria, and then between that and the submissions, you really have to think that Topuria is going to have a better chance to submit Volkanovski here than the other way around. If this fight goes to decision, I mean, Volk's got almost 5 times as much experience going the distance. But again, we just saw Topuria pick up a 50-43 in his last appearance. So it's not like the guy, there's no question mark anymore about can this guy do this for 5 rounds. He's already proven that he can go toe-to-toe with one of the, hardest hitters in that division and completely outclass him for, 25 minutes. So Topuria is going to have the edge here in attrition, just because he's never been finished, even though we've seen him knocked down a couple of times. He's got to be the more confident guy coming in. And I'm not just saying that because of the promos that he's cutting with, trying on the belt and kind of anointing himself champion ahead of time. I really try not to look too far into that because it seems like both of these guys respect each other in spite of the fact that Topuria has been kind of putting that on a little bit. I say that just because Topuria is undefeated. And Volk has tasted defeat now twice last year. He's not on the winning streak that he was before, riding high, running through all these people in the featherweight division. He's got to reclaim a little bit of credibility for himself. So I think this is going to be a pretty close fight. In a close fight, I've got to side with the guy that's got the age gap upside and according to the numbers, has the more well-rounded game available to him. And then the last part that makes me at least feel good about it relative to age is that record that fighters in welterweight and under have in title fights where someone is 35 or older is just not, they're something like 1 in 20. I mean, that is a trend that you just cannot ignore here. And I think that in a close fight like this, you really just have to go with the guy that is going to be on the plus money heading in, and that's Topuria. And I pointed this out when I was talking about Makhachev in the introduction of this podcast, that one of the narratives that I remember going into that is that when is the next time you're going to get this guy at this price? I think that there's going to be opportunities as Volkanovski is now heading into the second half of his 30s. There's going to be opportunities where he's lined at a price similar to minus 125, is a favorite with a little bit of juice, not this 200, 300, 400 favorite. The time for him is going to be coming where it's going to be close to him to be done, just because you don't know how many more years he's going to be able to do this, particularly with the style that he has. And you compare that to Topuria, who is 27. If he wins this fight, you are not getting Topuria at plus odds for another decade, maybe. It's going to be a long, long time if Topuria is the guy to beat Volkanovski at featherweight before you get anything close to this price again. I'm even surprised that he is available at the price that he is, given he was something like a 300 favorite over Josh Emmett, was virtually unplayable when he fought Jai Herbert. And I'm forgetting what he was priced against Bryce Mitchell, but I remember that he was the favorite in that. And I took Bryce Mitchell at underdog odds and paid for it pretty. And, I think I had a good night that night otherwise, but I think Bryce was one of my only underdog picks. And I remember thinking, oh, man, this wasn't really close. And all the Topuria supremacists were like, oh, how could you ever bet this hillbilly Bryce Mitchell? You fool. And it's like, oh, whatever. Okay. Like, Bryce was the more UFC tenured guy. And I keep pointing to the knockdown he got against Barboza. He's a better striker than he gives credit for, but did not have the boxing acumen that we've seen demonstrated from Topuria. So, again, close fight. I think Volk's more ripe for a knockout on Topuria than the other way around. Wouldn't surprise me to see Topuria knock out Volk, but I think all of the submission upside belongs to Topuria. And if this does go the distance, I have to side with the guy that has won a 5-round decision more recently than, the guy in Volkanovski who was, if that fight against Yair went 5 rounds, I don't think it's any question that he was going to end up winning that. But we've just seen Topuria do better and more recently in that circumstance than what we ended up seeing from Volkanovski against Makhachev. Even though Volk did win the 5th round against Makhachev, I don't see Topuria having the same cardio issues that we kind of saw Makhachev have in the later stage of that fight, even if he is implementing a wrestling-heavy game plan, which I think would probably be his best path to victory. But again, there's just too much upside in the full facet of mixed martial arts here to make me look at Topuria at plus money and think that isn't going to be the side. And you factor that in with all the, not only the age gap, but the trend of performances in title fights relative to 35-year-olds. Volkanovski bucks that trend. He's the featherweight GOAT. But you can't say Father Time is undefeated because, that trend, I think, like I said, is 1-20. But it's really, really difficult to beat Father Time. And I just don't see it happening for Volk here. It's a tricky matchup for him. And you hesitate to call this a passing of the torch moment, especially because I would think that Volk probably has a case for an immediate rematch if he does lose. But I don't know how you can look at this matchup and the discrepancies between these two guys and conclude that Volkanovski deserves to be the favorite here, even though it is lined closely. I think that Topuria should be the slight favorite. Instead, he is available at plus money, and for that reason, he's going to be my only underdog this week. I think Topuria probably wins a 48-47 decision. I think that he will end up, I'll say that he wins rounds 2, 3, and 4. I'll say that Volk gets the first round, but then struggles to kind of deal with the more well-round, like as Topuria is able to kind of make his reads and figure out where his entries are going to need to be timed. Volkanovski kind of struggles to figure out Topuria more than the other way around in rounds 2, 3, and 4 before finally coming out in the 5th round and kind of going for broke in a way where Topuria knows that he's banked the first or at least 3 of those earlier rounds and just kind of tries to survive to a decision in order to get his title. So I'll say Volk wins round 1 and 5, but Topuria does enough work in the rounds between that he is clearly ahead 3-1 going into the 5th, and Volk selling out for a finish gets him the 5th round, but Topuria still wins 48-47. And that's going to do it for the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 298. Thank you very much for tuning in. Please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube and follow on Twitter if you haven't already. We'll be back for UFC 299 next month, which is right down the street from where I'm recording this. I did get to go to UFC 287 last year, and that was quite a fond memory, getting to sit not quite on the floor, but I was on the rail. So like first row, very, very close to the cage. I was, maybe 25, 30 yards behind the commentary booth. Had a perfect vantage point for Izzy knocking out Pereira and saw a bunch of other great fights that evening. And I'm not going to be going to this one just because there's no way that 299 is going to live up to the hype that 287 had. But I will be looking forward to, a few different fights on that one, including the return of one of the only fighters to acknowledge MMA Rax, who was Mikhail Oleksiejczuk. So I look forward to breaking that fight down, and I look forward to the event next month. But again, thank you very much for tuning in, and good luck this weekend, folks. And yeah, go Topuria.